The cargo manifest flickered on the cracked screen, but Rena barely noticed. She was too busy scraping frost off the interior walls of her transport pod with a dull knife. 3 weeks hauling refrigerated medical supplies from Earth to the outer colonies, and the heating unit had died somewhere past Jupiter. She'd wrapped herself in every blanket she owned and kept going. That was the human way, apparently. Rena didn't think of herself as special. She was just a low-tier freight runner, the kind of person who took the routes nobody else wanted because they paid enough to keep her ship fueled and her belly fed. The galaxy was full of species with better technology, longer lifespans, and fancier vessels. Humans were the newcomers, the ones still figuring out how to not accidentally insult a Krillian diplomat or misread a Vorthian trade agreement. But humans had one thing going for them. They didn't quit. The communications panel beeped. Rena frowned and tapped it with stiff fingers. A distress signal, weak and stuttering, coming from somewhere off the main shipping lane. She checked her fuel reserves and groaned. Answering distress calls wasn't profitable, and her margins were already razor thin. The signal beeped again. Rena closed her eyes and made the turn point. 2 hours later, she found the source. A small escape pod tumbled through space, its emergency beacon barely functioning. The design was unfamiliar, all smooth curves and bioluminescent panels that pulsed with faint purple light. Definitely not human make. She maneuvered her transport alongside and extended the docking clamp. The pod shuddered as it connected, and Rena cycled the airlock, her hand resting on the plasma cutter at her hip. Pirates sometimes used fake distress signals to lure in easy prey. The inner door hissed open. What came through wasn't a pirate. IT was small, maybe half Rena's height, covered in dark scales that shimmered like oil on water. For legs, 2 smaller arms folded against its chest, and a head that seemed too large for its body. Its eyes were huge and golden, with vertical pupils that contracted when they met the light of her cargo bay. Juvenile Sarlith. Rena's breath caught. The Sarlith were one of the oldest species in the known galaxy, and they didn't interact much with younger races. They certainly didn't let their offspring wander around in broken escape pods. This was either a very lost child or something much worse. The creature made a sound, high and warbling, and Rena realized it was crying. She knelt down slowly, keeping her movements calm. The Sarlith hatchling watched her with those enormous eyes, trembling. Its scales were dull in places, a sign of dehydration or stress. Maybe both. Rena reached back and grabbed one of her water pouches, the kind with a flexible straw. She held it out. The hatchling sniffed, then reached forward with one tiny clawed hand and took it. It drank desperately, and Rena felt something tighten in her chest. She'd grown up in the slums of New Jakarta, back when Earth was still clawing its way into galactic society. She knew what it felt like to be small and scared and alone. Species didn't matter when it came to that. The hatchling finished the water and made another sound, softer this time. It stepped closer and pressed against Rena's leg. She looked at the broken escape pod, then at her cargo hold full of medical supplies that absolutely had to reach the colony on time, then back at the small creature that was now gripping the fabric of her flight suit with surprising strength. Rena sighed and picked up the hatchling. It weighed almost nothing. She carried it to the cockpit and set it in the co-pilot's seat, which was mostly used for storing spare tools. The Sarlith curled up immediately, its tail wrapping around itself. Within seconds, it was asleep. Rena pulled up the navigation charts. The colony was still 2 days away. She had no idea where the nearest Sarlith settlement was, and even if she did, showing up with someone's lost child would probably cause an interstellar incident. But she couldn't just leave it. She set the autopilot and leaned back in her chair, watching the small creature breathe. Its scales caught the light from the control panels, shifting through shades of deep purple and blue. Somewhere out there, someone was probably looking for this hatchling. Rena would figure out how to find them. After she delivered her cargo, after she fixed her heating unit, after she did all the other impossible things she did every day just to survive. That was what humans did, after all. They kept going. The hatchling woke up 6 hours later and immediately started making noises that Rena couldn't interpret. She was elbow deep in the heating unit's guts, trying to splice together two frayed wires with electrical tape and hope, when the warbling grew louder. She extracted herself from the maintenance panel and found the Sarlith standing in the cockpit doorway, swaying slightly. Its scales had dulled further, and Rinna realized with a spike of panic that she had no idea what this species ate. She pulled up the ship's database and searched for Sarlith dietary requirements. The results were frustratingly vague. The entry mentioned that Sarlith were obligate carnivores with complex nutritional needs, but it didn't specify what kind of protein or in what form. There was a note at the bottom stating that Sarlith biology was considered restricted information by their Council of Elders. Helpful. Rinna opened her food storage and stared at the contents. Protein bars, freeze-dried vegetables, instant noodles, and 3 vacuum-sealed packages of synthetic beef that tasted like cardboard. She grabbed one of the beef packages and tore it open. The hatchling's head perked up immediately. It scrambled forward, moving faster than Rinna expected, and snatched the meat from her hands. It ate with desperate efficiency, making small, satisfied sounds between bites. At least that problem was solved. Rinna sat on the floor and watched the creature eat. Now that it wasn't actively dying, she could see it more clearly. The scales weren't just dark. They had an iridescent quality that shifted colors depending on the angle. The golden eyes were intelligent, tracking her movements with obvious awareness. This wasn't just some animal. This was a person, a very young, very lost person. When the hatchling finished eating, it looked at Rinna and made a different sound, almost like a question. She shrugged helplessly. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then the hatchling walked over and climbed into Rinna's lap. She froze. The scales felt smooth and surprisingly warm. The creature curled up against her, its breathing slowing as it relaxed. Rinna very carefully put one hand on its back, and it made a rumbling sound that might have been contentment. Something in her chest cracked open. She'd been alone for 3 years, ever since she scraped together enough credits to buy this barely functional transport pod and strike out on her own. Independence had seemed like freedom back then. Now it mostly felt like isolation. The galaxy was huge and full of people, but Rinna had learned that being surrounded by others didn't mean you weren't alone. This small creature, though, trusted her. It had nothing and no one, and it had chosen to curl up at her lap like she was safety itself. Rinna made a decision. She would get the hatchling home, whatever it took. Even if it meant missing deliveries or burning through her savings or calling in favors she didn't have. Someone out there was missing this child, and they deserved to have it back. But first, she had a cargo run to finish. She gently moved the sleeping Sarlith to the co-pilot chair and returned to the heating unit. The wires finally cooperated, and blessed warmth began flowing through the cabin. Rinna allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before returning to the cockpit. The hatchling was still asleep, but now its scales had regained some of their luster. Good. That meant it was recovering. Rinna pulled up the communications panel and started recording a message. She kept it simple, explaining that she'd found a Sarlith hatchling in distress and was looking for its family. She set the message to broadcast on all standard emergency channels, then added it to the colonial network for good measure. If anyone was looking, they'd find her. The transport continued through the dark, carrying medical supplies, one exhausted human, and one very small passenger who had accidentally chosen the best possible person to find it, because Rinna wouldn't quit. She never had, and she wasn't about to start now. The colony station appeared on the view screen like a cluster of lights against the void. New Meridian, barely 5 years old, and already struggling with a population boom. The medical supplies in Rinna's cargo hold were desperately needed. According to the colony administrator who'd placed the order, the Sarlith hatchling pressed against the cockpit window, its scales brightening with what Rinna had learned was excitement. Over the past day, she'd started recognizing patterns in its behavior. Bright scales meant happy or curious. Dull scales meant scared or tired. The rumbling sound was definitely contentment, and the high warble was distress. They hadn't exactly developed a common language, but they were managing. Rinna guided the transport into the docking bay and powered down the engines. The hatchling looked at her expectantly. She'd been dreading this part. Station regulations were clear about undocumented passengers, especially non-human ones. If she declared the Sarlith, There would be paperwork, questions, possibly even quarantine protocols. That could take days, and she didn't have days. Her next cargo run was scheduled to depart in 18 hours, and she needed every credit from that job. But she also couldn't leave a child alone on her ship. The hatchling solved the problem by climbing into her equipment bag. Rena stared at it. The Sarlith looked back with those huge golden eyes and made a soft sound, as if to say this was obviously the solution. It curled up among her tools and spare parts, its scales dimming to match the dark interior of the bag. Camouflage. Of course, Rena zipped the bag most of the way closed, leaving a gap for air, and slung it over her shoulder. The hatchling weighed maybe 10 pounds. She could manage that. The docking official barely glanced at her manifest before waving her through. New Meridian was too busy for thorough inspections, apparently. Rena made her way to the cargo distribution center and handed off the medical supplies to a very grateful logistics coordinator. Credits transferred to her account. She allowed herself a brief moment of relief before the reality set in. She had enough for fuel and basic supplies, but nothing extra. No cushion for emergencies, no buffer for the unexpected. The equipment bag shifted against her hip, right? She had one pretty significant unexpected situation already. Rena found a quiet corner in the station's main concourse and opened the bag. The hatchling peeked out, then scrambled up her arm to perch on her shoulder. Several passers-by glanced at them, but this was a frontier colony. Weird was relative. She needed to find out if anyone had responded to her messages. There was a public communications terminal near the market district. Rena headed that way, trying to look casual despite having an alien child using her head as a lookout post. The terminal showed 3 new messages in her queue. Her heart jumped. The first was spam. Someone selling faster-than-light engine upgrades she absolutely couldn't afford. The second was from her next client, confirming pickup details. The third was from an unknown sender with a Sarlith designation that Rena's hand shook as she opened it. The message was audio only. A voice spoke in the standard language, but with a resonance that suggested a non-human throat structure. The accent was precise, almost musical. We have received your transmission regarding the hatchling. Your compassion is noted. However, the situation is more complex than you may understand. The youngling you have found is named Corinth, and they are not merely lost. They fled. Rena's stomach dropped. The voice continued. Corinth is the offspring of our council leader. There was a disagreement about their future, about the path they should take. The child did not wish to follow the traditions demanded of them. They took an escape pod and disappeared into the dark. We have been searching. A pause. The council demands Corinth's return. But I'm not speaking on behalf of the council right now. I am speaking as Corinth's secondary parent, the one who taught them to question and to think beyond our ancient ways. If you return them to us, they will be forced into a life they do not want. If you keep them, you will make an enemy of one of the oldest civilizations in known space. Another pause, longer this time. But perhaps there is a third option. Contact me at these coordinates. Speak to no one else of this. And please, keep Corinth safe. They chose to trust a human. That choice may be wiser than even they know. The message ended. Rena sat very still. The hatchling, Corinth, made a questioning sound from her shoulder. She'd thought she was rescuing a lost child. Instead, she'd stumbled into what sounded like a custody dispute with interstellar political implications. The smart thing would be to return Corinth immediately, apologize profusely, and get as far away from this situation as possible. But Rena looked at those golden eyes, at the small creature who had curled up in her lap and trusted her to keep them safe. She thought about what the message had said. They fled. They did not wish to follow the traditions demanded of them. She knew what that felt like. Rena copied the coordinates and deleted the message. Then she picked up her equipment bag, made sure Corinth was secure, and headed back to her ship. She had a decision to make, and apparently 18 hours to make it. Rena sat in her cockpit, staring at the coordinates from a message. Corinth had fallen asleep again, this time in a makeshift nest she'd created from her spare blankets. The hatchling's breathing was steady, peaceful. They had no idea the trouble they'd caused just by existing. She pulled up what little information she could find about Sarlith culture. Most of it was restricted or deliberately vague, but a few things were clear. The Sarlith valued tradition above almost everything. Their society was ancient, structured, and deeply hierarchical. Children were expected to follow the paths chosen for them by the council. Deviation was not tolerated. Corinth's parent, the one who sent the message, had called themselves the secondary parent. That suggested a family structure different from what Rena knew. She wondered what it meant that this parent was willing to go against the council. Her communications panel beeped. Another incoming message, this one with an official Sarlith Council seal. That Rena's blood went cold. She opened it. The voice was different from before, older and carrying in weight of absolute authority. Human transport vessel registered to Rena Voss. We are aware you have found Council Leader Merthin's offspring. Your interference in this matter is unwelcome. Return the hatchling to Sarlith space immediately, and you will be compensated for your trouble. Refuse, and you will face consequences that extend beyond your understanding. The message ended abruptly. Corinth stirred in their nest, making a small distressed sound even in sleep. Their scales had dulled to almost black. Rena looked at the two messages, one threatening her, one asking for help, both about the same small creature who had done nothing wrong except want to choose their own life. She'd grown up poor, but she'd grown up free. Her parents had given her that much before they died, the freedom to decide who she wanted to be. She made plenty of mistakes with that freedom, taken plenty of wrong turns, but they'd been her choices. Corinth deserved the same. Rena pulled up the coordinates from the secondary parent and plotted a course. It would take her off the main shipping lanes, cost her fuel she couldn't spare, and probably end with her making enemies of a civilization that had been exploring the galaxy when humans were still figuring out agriculture. But she'd made her decision back in that cargo bay when she'd picked up a crying child and given them water. Everything after that was just following through. She initiated the launch sequence. Corinth woke up as the ship began to move. The hatchling scrambled up to the co-pilot chair and looked at the view screen, then at Rena. Those golden eyes were far too knowing for something so small. Rena wondered if Corinth understood what was happening. If they knew the danger they were both in. The hatchling made the rumbling sound and leaned against Rena's arm. Maybe understanding didn't matter. Maybe trust was enough. The journey took 16 hours. Rena spent most of it running calculations and second-guessing herself. She'd missed her next cargo pickup, which meant she'd lost that income. Her savings were draining. If this went wrong, she'd be broke and probably wanted by Sarlith authorities. But Corinth seemed happier as they traveled. The hatchling explored the ship, investigated every corner and compartment, and made excited sounds when discovering something new. They played with the loose tools in Rena's equipment bag, organizing them by size with surprising precision. They watched the stars with obvious wonder. This was a child who wanted to experience things, to learn, to grow beyond the boundaries they'd been born into. Rena couldn't take that away from them. The coordinates led to a small orbital platform in an unclaimed system. Old but functional. A single ship was docked there, Sarlith design, but smaller than the massive vessels their species typically used. Personal transport, maybe. Rena sent a hailing signal. The response came immediately. The same voice from a message, warm and concerned. Rena Voss. Thank you for coming. For trusting. Please dock on the port side. I am alone, and I am unarmed. I only want to speak. She maneuvered the transport into position and activated the docking clamps. Corinth pressed against her leg, scales brightening with what looked like recognition. The airlock cycled. A Sarlith emerged. Much larger than Corinth, but with similar coloring. Their scales were darker, almost midnight blue, with streaks of silver that suggested age. They moved with careful dignity, and their golden eyes held a depth of emotion that caught Rena off guard. The Sarlith looked at Corinth and made a complex sound, layered with harmonics the human ears couldn't fully process. The hatchling responded with their own sounds, and then something remarkable happened. Corinth ran forward and the adult caught them, holding them close with obvious relief. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the adult looked at Rena. "Thank you," they said in standard, their voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for keeping my child safe." The adult Sarlith, who introduced themselves as Venth, settled carefully on the floor of Rena's cargo hold. Corinth remained pressed against their side, scales bright and content. Rena leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed, trying to process what was happening. Venth's voice was gentle when they spoke. "I imagine you have questions. A few," Rena said dryly. "Like why a council leader's kid is running away in an escape pod, or why you're meeting me in secret instead of just bringing them home." Venth's scales rippled in a pattern Rena couldn't interpret. "Among our people, children are not born to parents by chance. They are carefully planned, genetically selected, and assigned roles before they even hatch. Corinth was designated to be a military commander, to lead our defense fleets, to uphold traditions that have stood for millennia. And Corinth doesn't want that," Rena guessed. "Corinth wants to study xenobiology." Venth's voice carried something that might have been pride mixed with sorrow. "They want to understand other species, to learn how different forms of life adapt and survive. They want to explore, not command. They want to ask questions, not enforce answers." Rena looked at the small hatchling. Corinth was playing with one of her tools again, examining it with obvious fascination. "Not the behavior of someone destined to be a military leader. The council will not allow deviation," Venth continued. "Meridian, my partner and Corinth's primary parent, believes absolutely in our ways. They love Corinth, but they cannot understand why the child would reject their assigned purpose. To them, it is inconceivable. But you understand," Rena said. That Venth's scales darkened. "I was like Corinth once. I wanted to study music, to compose harmonies that bridged different species' hearing ranges. Instead, I became an administrator, a secondary parent, a role I have filled adequately, but without passion. I will not watch my child lose themselves the same way as you helped them escape. I gave them access to an escape pod and did not alert the council when I discovered it missing." Venth met Rena's eyes. "I am complicit. If this is discovered, I will lose everything. But Corinth's freedom is worth more than my position." Rena's throat tightened. She understood sacrificing for family. Her parents had done it for her, working themselves into early graves so she could have opportunities they never had. But this felt bigger somehow, more complicated. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Venth reached out and gently touched Corinth's head. The hatchling leaned into the contact. "I want you to take my child away from starless space, far enough that the council cannot easily reclaim them. I want you to help Corinth learn what they need to survive among other species, to teach them about humans and your strange, wonderful flexibility, your ability to adapt and change and become something different than what you were born to be." Rena nearly laughed. "You picked the wrong human. I'm a cargo hauler, barely keeping my ship running. I'm broke, I'm alone, and I have no idea how to raise a kid, especially not one from a species I know nothing about. Yet you answered a distress call when you could have ignored it." Venth's voice was firm. "You gave Corinth water when they were dying. You fed them when they were hungry. You kept them safe when you could have turned them over to authorities. You did all this despite having every reason not to. That's just basic decency. And oh," Venth's scales brightened. "That is what humans call compassion. That is why Corinth chose your species when they fled. They looked at galactic records and saw that humans, despite being newcomers and often struggling, consistently choose to help others, even at cost to themselves, even when it makes no logical sense." Rena didn't know what to say to that. She'd never thought of herself as particularly compassionate. She'd just done what anyone would do when faced with a scared child. "Except clearly not everyone would do that, and I can't keep them," she said finally. "I'm not set up for this. I don't have the resources or the knowledge or the stability. They need someone who can actually take care of them properly." Corinth made a sound, and Venth translated without being asked. "They say you already do take care of them properly. They feel safe with you. They trust you." The hatchling was looking at her now with those enormous golden eyes, and Rena felt her resolve crumbling. "This is insane," she muttered. Venth reached into a pouch and withdrew a small data chip. "This contains everything you need to know about caring for a Sarlith hatchling. Dietary needs, medical information, developmental stages. Also included are encrypted access codes to several of my personal accounts. Enough credits to support both of you comfortably for several years. Rena stared at the chip. I can't take your money. It is not a gift. It is payment. You are now Corinth's guardian. It is your job to ensure they survive and thrive. The credits are tools for that purpose. Venth pressed the chip into her hand. Please, I cannot protect my child, but you can. You already have. Rena stood in her cargo bay 2 hours later, watching Venth's ship undock and disappear into the dark. Corinth sat on a crate beside her, scales dim with sadness, but also something that looked like determination that she'd said yes. Of course she'd said yes. What else could she do when faced with a parent giving up everything to save their child? When faced with a kid who just wanted the chance to choose their own path, she was probably going to regret this. The data chip was already loaded into her ship systems. She'd spent the last hour reviewing the information while Venth and Corinth had their goodbye. Sarlith hatchlings needed protein-rich diets, moderate temperatures, and mental stimulation. They were highly intelligent and learned quickly. They bonded deeply with caregivers and could live for several centuries. Rena was 32 years old and would be lucky to see 80. She was agreeing to raise a child who would outlive her by hundreds of years. That should have terrified her. Instead, she felt oddly calm. Corinth made a questioning sound. Rena looked down at them and tried to smile. "So," she said. "I guess we're doing this. You and me against the galaxy. I hope you know what you're getting into, kid." The hatchling climbed up her leg and perched on her shoulder, the now familiar position they preferred. Their scales brightened slightly, that shimmer of colors that meant they were content. Rena pulled up the navigation charts. The credits from Venth had already transferred. She had options now, real choices. She could upgrade the ship, take better jobs, stop scraping by, and actually build something stable. A life, not just a survival. But first, they needed to get far away from Sarlith space. She plotted a course toward the frontier, where species mixed freely and nobody asked too many questions about your past. Places where a human cargo hauler with an alien kid wouldn't attract too much attention. Places where Corinth could learn and grow without fear of being dragged back to a life they didn't want. As the ship began to move, Rena felt Corinth's small form relaxing against her neck. The hatchling started making that rumbling sound. The one she'd learned meant safety and happiness. She thought about what Venth had said, about humans and their compassion, about choosing to help even when it cost them. She'd never seen herself that way before. She'd always just been trying to survive, to keep moving forward one day at a time. Maybe that was enough. Maybe surviving with kindness and tact was its own form of courage. The galaxy stretched out before them, vast and full of possibilities. Somewhere out there, the Sarlith Council was probably searching. Somewhere, Meridian was grieving a child they couldn't understand. Somewhere, Venth was facing consequences for the choice they'd made. But here, in this barely functional transport ship, a human and a Sarlith hatchling were starting something new. Something that didn't fit into ancient traditions or rigid roles. Something messy and uncertain and real. Corinth shifted and made a sound that might have been their version of a question. Rena reached up and gently touched their scales. "We'll figure it out," she said quietly. "One day at a time. I'll teach you what I know about surviving out here. About being flexible and adaptable and refusing to quit. And you'll teach me about your people and your language and whatever else you want to learn. Deal?" The hatchling's scales brightened fully, brilliant colors rippling across their small form. They touched their head to Rena's cheek in what she recognized as affection. Deal, apparently. Rena set the autopilot and leaned back in her chair. Corinth curled up in her lap, already falling asleep. Through the view screen, the stars shone steadily, and somewhere ahead was a future neither of them could predict, but they'd face it together. A cargo hauler who refused to leave a child behind, and a child who'd chosen to trust in human compassion. The galaxy didn't know what to make of them, yet they'd figure it out as they went.